In Callisto Protocol, an idea would be heralded as the thing that would propel humanity forward through the stars. At the time, while we had access to our solar system and the resources and materials therein, existing on moons of other planets and likely on other planets in the inner solar system itself, it became quite apparent that humanity was not built for anything but Earth. Sure, we could exist on other planets and even in space for a short while, but issues began to crop up rather quickly that if we wanted to long-term move past our solar system and even reside more effectively off of Earth, we would need to overcome our own biological constraints. With this idea at the forefront of the cult-like group's mind of elevating humanity past a single system species status, say that 3 times fast, eventually their concerns would be answered, or so they thought. You see, the issue is, when you are looking for something specific, when something comes along that maybe looks like it, you're more inclined to believe that this was a direct answer given to you. And that's because our brains are pattern-seeking meat. Take for instance our search for life in the face on Mars. When the first images came back to Earth, everyone was ecstatic because they thought this meant there must have been life on Mars at some point, which arguably would have been more depressing because that means they went extinct, but it was really just a few mountain ranges with the sun at just the right angle to make it look like it was a face. Had our brains not been pre-programmed to see faces in everything, faces that look specifically like us to be exact, then we may not have actually seen a face on Mars in the first place as like specifically a face. Instead, we may have seen it for what it actually was, which was just a trick of the light and some rocks. This same pattern-seeking behavior extrapolates out to other things as well. With our knowledge that somehow we would need to evolve ourselves out of our current build and into a new one, the cult would see this new biophage pathogen as clearly the answer to our alterations to our DNA that we would need in order to push humanity to where we needed much faster than the traditional millions of years routes. But how did this all start? Well, we'll get to that momentarily because first, this episode is sponsored by Raycon. Are you ready to listen to music with high quality earbuds at half the price of normal brands? Of course you are, because you're just a Chad like that. Clicking the link in the description box or going to buyraycon.com/Roanoke, you get 15% off your Raycon purchase today. My Raycons are pretty sweet. I personally use them a lot when I'm in the gym because I'm not trying to listen to the Jackson 5 sing about their ABCs while I'm going for a PR. But even if that isn't your thing, with their 8 hours of playtime and 32-hour battery life, you can listen to anything you want. Podcasts, music, nature sounds on camping trips, which would be a little weird because you're on a camping trip. Whatever you want. That may sound like a long time, right? Well, with their comfortable gel tips ranging in 5 sizes and comfortable actual ear-shaped design, which is also noise isolating as a result, these earbuds are designed to be left in all day if you like. And now with their updated pairing, you can actually walk up to 33 feet away from your phone and still have great quality sound. So if all that sounds interesting to you and something that you might want, then by going to the description box or to buyraycon.com/Roanoke, you get 15% off your order today. All right, let's get back to it. Having come across the colony and the Leviathan and subsequently Patient Zero, it was obvious that this was the thing they needed. Ignoring all the warning signs of how Callisto literally had its life altered to the point that it appeared to be monsters because of it, it was tested on the colonists after the initial conflict with the Leviathan. Realizing rather quickly that they didn't actually have the parameters set under normal circumstances that they needed to control everything, this snowballed into a plethora of issues. The first issue was that the colonists were not stupid. They quickly noticed that people were going missing even though there was a current outbreak, but there were high-profile people not showing up for work, such as the dig foreman, as more and more people began exhibiting a sickness spreading through them. And even though Subject Zero was created by the initial outbreak of the disease, continued testing really kind of made people upset, and this would kind of make sense. See, Subject Zero was a fusing of both the biophage pathogen and the human genome. However, something was clearly different about this person in comparison with all the others. Whereas most would turn into mindless monsters attacking and maiming anyone they came across, Subject Zero still had full control of his cognitive faculties and still possessed the ability to evolve to his, or at least adapt quickly to his, environment. If you would like an explanation as to why this is the case, I actually have a whole video that covers this, and I'll link it at the end of this video, as it gets into the genetics pretty good, as well as the type of immune system response Subject Zero would have needed in order to allow this to happen. Because of the creation of Subject Zero and having no real knowledge of how to control any of these things, or really how to deal with them, they basically just put him down by security forces and studied him over the next several decades until the cult felt ready enough to try again. A prison would be erected near the site of the original colony Arcas, where prisoners from all over would be transported to. But not only that, the cult and the warden of Black Iron would need a specific amount of guards and a specific type of personality for doctors who, according to their logs, either had like behavioral issues or craved too much power or were willing to engage in unethical treatment and experimentation, as they had shown previously they had no problems in doing so and were relieved of their jobs. Once collecting all these people, the testing would begin. Black Iron Prison being nothing more than simply a front for one of the worst science experiments I've ever seen. I mean, good lord. Talk about like a scatterblast of information that would not be reproducible in like any situation. I mean, like, think about it. They couldn't replicate the original scenario that led to Subject Zero immediately, so they turned to just releasing the biophage pathogen into the general population in hopes that it would somehow, by random happenstance, create the patient zero needed. Okay, so conspiracy. I know this is kind of going out on a limb, and this is detracting from what we have seen, so take it with a grain of salt, but I'd say how Jacob is a Subject Zero of sorts, considering all the times that he's been exposed to the pathogen, was able to survive and not have issues. I believe we may see that in Callisto Protocol 2, actual good game Boogaloo? How many times am I allowed to use that joke? Anyhow, once the biophage pathogen had reached the point where consistent testing on prisoners had yielded no results that were desirable, it was then released on Europa with an attempt to give it a more wild-type growth, but this would immediately turn out unsuccessful. This should have probably been a large indicator that the pathogen itself was not reliant on environmental factors, but instead was altered in a large part by the human interaction with the biophage pathogen. What I find interesting is on Europa, it almost appears like potentially a different version of this biophage pathogen was released, as this appears to have led to the end of those people living there as their bodies gave up, which led to their expiration. Because on Callisto, it did anything but that, and it's not too far-fetched to believe, as mentioned in my video covering the actual pathogen itself, we see that it is a virus of some sorts, and viruses do mutate, which I'm all sure that we're very familiar with at this point in our lives. From here, the warden had a galaxy brain idea: release it into the general population for funsies and see what happens. I mean, I get it. No results the other way, right? Let's try again the same way it was done on Arcas. The problem is, with such limited test subjects, you may not actually have the right variables in place that led to those same results. In this case, nothing was known what made Subject Zero special, and because of that, it could be anything, even coming down to a weaker form of biophage pathogen. But it didn't matter, because like a bowling alley on $1 beer night, a bunch of convicts were about to engage in a building-wide brawl for their life. Obviously, the easiest approach to understanding the effects on this and what it has on the body is to start from the most basic form of these creatures. These are simply known as grunts. The grunts are those who have recently turned and are the weakest version of those infected, but that by no means implies they are easy to overcome. Because remember, Jacob is in prison. He has no real answer to these things besides hand-to-hand combat and swinging away, Meryl. But the beauty of that is we get nice and close to seeing what these things actually become. Again, you're going to have to watch the other video I did, as it goes really in depth as to what's going on genetically with these guys, but we will do a quick synopsis of them before getting to their physiology and internal anatomy, as it made them into what they are. And I don't plan on becoming 343, where it's like I do a video, but there's like 12 other handwritten notes I've posted around my office that you have to come read to understand what the hell I'm talking about in a video. Jacob exits his cell after waking up from a jump scare, which happens a lot, you'll come to find out when you play this game. The first thing you will notice is that someone is trapped in their cell relatively close. They are on the ground gasping for air and coughing. This infection would seemingly begin first in the lungs. And again, this is a quick Spark Notes version, so to some of you it may sound relatively familiar, but for all new people, they may need a drop-in point to realize that this is purely an infection and not some elder god influence like in Dead Space. Once the lungs are compromised, seeing as this is a viral infection, it will then quickly move into the bloodstream, accessing the pulmonary vein through the alveolar sac. At this point, you are fully infected. Quickly being circulated around the body, all types of blood cells are infected and destroyed, which leads to damaged blood vessels, which are seen as dark lines all over the body, as well as decreased blood flow. This is where your body really begins struggling for survival, as not only your lungs are compromised, which is decreasing your oxygen saturation levels, but your blood has now less carrying capacity and is leaking fluid into the surrounding tissue, as your blood vessel lining has now been split and broken in areas. This continues to have a cascading effect on the rest of the body, as when you start losing oxygen, your body is going to start expiring. This presents itself symptomatically as weakness and muscle spasms, and this is why you find a lot of people curled up on the ground coughing, as they are quite literally too weak to stand, as their nervous system tissue is also meeting its end due to the lack of oxygen. This also will start to affect more of their outward appearance too at this point, as their hair begins to fall out, as those cells are dying off due to oxygen deprivation or just complete infection and alteration of the cell function itself. Ultimately, as enough time passes, this will result in the first stage of infection, known as a grunt. The grunt metabolically has been altered to account for this increased evolution that the warden was looking for originally. This evolution, however, seems much more like a step back from the Homo sapiens perspective than a leap forward. Mentally, the grunt is quite hindered. Their brain has been subdued largely by both the infection and the breakdown of the life support system, known as their meat suit. This has led to a loss of many cognitive factors, like ability to plan and reason, meaning the frontal lobe has been largely destroyed, or is just basically not operating at its real capacity, which it's sort of important to the human experience. Other areas of the brain associated with emotional control and likely memory will be altered, meaning the limbic system is not firing in conjunction with the other areas of the brain to control the person. which has led to massive levels of aggression to spike. This aggression is translated into strength, as well as the brain would be under the impression there was a need for massive levels of adrenaline to be dumped into the system at all times. But concerning anatomy, we'll talk about why they are stronger in a moment. As the disease progresses, we begin to see the first examples of what these former people are to become. Because of the genetic tampering and their overhauled metabolisms, skin folds will appear all over the body as the skin has become almost cancerous in terms of growth. This is shown to extend itself to the other systems of the body as muscular and as with bone growth as well. All parts of the body appear to be growing at once due to the new incoming information, but on top of that, new appendages will also be growing as well. In some grunts, an extra set of thumbs can be seen growing on the hands, indicating that new bones and ligaments have begun taking shape. So the question is, why would this be the case? Well, I'm glad you asked. You're pretty smart, because I've always had fun talking about new appendages being grown, am I right? So, when you were forming in your mother's womb, after the sperm cell fertilized the egg, which I have to clarify something, the egg does not engulf the sperm cell. The sperm uses enzymes to disrupt the surface of the egg cell and then forces its way into the egg. If you didn't know, it's actually like a team effort, because the first sperm cell to reach the egg is usually not the one that fertilizes the egg, as several sperm cell enzymes are needed to allow for the egg to actually be fertilized. I had someone say in my comments the other day that I was completely wrong about it, and it just blew my mind that this person wasn't taught this in like middle school biology. Anyhow, just know the egg does not engulf a sperm cell, and that's the takeaway on that. So once your two cells go from haploid to diploid and you are a human organism, you have all the information to continue growing into what you are today. As your cells differentiate, they hit different milestones to create you as a cluster of cells, and then you as a tube, and then you that looks like a dolphin, and then finally you that looks like a human fetus. This information is stored within your genetic coding, and once you are born, it still remains in there. In some animals, such as lizards, they can regrow their tails because the cells at the end are programmed to not lose this ability and to remember how to regrow once the tail is lost. In animals such as ourselves, this information is flipped off via gene switches and never turned back on. Scientists have begun to actually track down these areas, and in the future it may be possible to turn these back on, but they're just in random locations and there appears to be a lot of them. So if that becomes the case, amputations may no longer result in lifelong alterations to the body, and instead the cells at the end of the wound would regrow the limb that has been lost. Now, it won't be like Deadpool where it quickly happens, and I would imagine one of the issues we may face is accelerating this growth, because let's say you lost your leg. After 10 years, you would have a 10-year-old's leg on an adult body, which wouldn't be that useful to you. But the point is that information isn't just lost. Instead, when the grunt is infected, it's clear that a lot of these genes are effectively switched back on, resulting in the extra appendages that we see from time to time. Although it's not really growing for any particular reason, it's just sort of like every gene at this point is switched on, and that's because of the virus implanting its coding, and it appears to also be forcing a reading of the genome itself. But before getting into the other internal anatomy to help explain these creatures, we must first talk about their physical morphology to get an idea of what we're dealing with. Starting with the feet, we can assume they are gross pig-like feet like the rest of its body and how it looks. A lot of them are wearing shoes, seeing as they just recently changed and have yet to burst out of them like they would in their later forms due to the increased mass brought on by the infection. Moving up the legs, on the back of the calves, we see some of the skin begins bunching up on the soleus and gastrocnemius due to the skin growing at a rapid rate due to the higher metabolisms exhibit overall. The muscle mass in this area can also be assumed to have increased as well. Moving up to the knees, nothing has changed here as it's still relatively in a human form, and as such, the structure of the leg and bones would not have changed. This has left them with the plantigrade structuring the same as normal. Continuing up to the thighs, we see the same growth continuing with the skin, and mass here has also increased. We can also assume that since these creatures on average appear taller than Jacob, the long bones, such as the femur, have also lengthened. This put more stress on the jumpsuit that they wear, tearing it and making it appear lower on the shoulders if present at all. Pelvis is where we begin to see interesting growth patterns. It's clear the pelvis itself is increasing in size, which has altered the connection points with the head of the femur. Likely this growth extends to the spine itself, which gives the grunt a hunched over appearance as its body appears to be unstable to a degree, with rapid growths happening all over the body and appearing to actually seem like it's happening more on like one side of the body versus on the other side, which gives it an uneven gait. Moving up to the abdomen, you guessed it, more growth, look at you. Also, I'd like to take a moment to point out how absolutely trash the photo mode is. As a result, it is ridiculously tough to get any footage of these things because it's like operating a flight simulator with your hands made out of a concrete fridge. The thoracic region appears to be similar to that of a human form, but we can assume the ribs are increasing in size, making the cavity larger, which is apropos because I forgot to mention about the stomach is that the intestines are likely growing in there as well, filling up the abdomen, which is critical to their later changes, but we'll talk about that here in a moment. moment, and this allows for more nutrition to be taken up from anything that is eaten, fueling the increased metabolism. With this increased metabolism, you will need more oxygen unless you're running off a completely new gas, or potentially the metabolism's anaerobic in operation, which I seriously doubt because you actually get less adenosine triphosphate from that, or ATP, which means larger lungs would be needed. Moving down to the arms, we can clearly see muscle mass has been added to the biceps and triceps of this creature, but we also see on the forearms themselves, they have been lengthened, adding to the validity that long bones are increasing in size. Moving down to the hands, they still appear relatively in their normal human form, but with some, an extra thumb can be seen growing near the original thumb as the infection is taking a deeper hold. Moving up to the head, these creatures have seen better days. Their faces are highly distorted due to the bone and skin growth. Their eyes are still visible, but in some cases they have either lost their eye, or because of the lens thickening in the eyes, they appear almost like they're cloudy, sort of like with glaucoma, and this I guess we could assume that they're likely blind, but clearly they can still see. The mouth has lost all their lips, and instead, a few teeth can be seen. Taking into consideration the size of their ears, this may suggest that the skull has overall increased in size, potentially making the brain larger as well, meaning that everything has continued to grow, and this is where we begin to run into issues. Internally, this brain growth gives us an idea of why they are struggling. First, I would say brain damage is likely very much so present in those who were infected due to the earlier stages where they were in an oxygen-deprived state. But once the body started to grow, what was left of their brains would grow as well, just like everything else. There is an idea that more brain mass equals more smart, right? But that's not necessarily the case. The reason humans are pretty intelligent is not only how dense our neurological connections are, which did you know each neuron can actually have about 15,000 connections, it's also hypothesized and basically agreed on there are around 100 billion neurons total. But also, the size of our brain is an important factor. Currently, our brains are at a point where everything runs fairly well. Our brains are able to receive the nutrients they need, are able to maintain cooling at its current size, and informational signals are able to travel quite quickly to where they need to go in order to produce conscious thought. But by increasing those connections, or in general just having neurons divide in the brain on this large scale, which in turn, this will actually cause the signals to have to travel through more meat to complete a thought. And this would just slow the brain down, and as a result, slow the person down mentally. In fact, it would be fairly bad to have a larger brain.
This is big brain time.
And if Einstein is anything to go off of, he actually had a smaller brain than normal, but more folds known as gyri. And it should also be noted that on the parietal lobes, they were about 15% larger than normal, but the rest of the brain was not as large as normal. Now, the thing to know about this area of the brain is it is associated with mathematical performance, but in general, along with the corpus callosum having more connection points, Einstein actually had more gyri. So this folding appears to have a direct effect on intellect and information processing. By just adding in more neurons, the grunts would lose their humanity and become monsters. Externally, in the skin, you can see the result of this infection and the battle that took place therein. Pustules appear all over the body, almost reminding me of buboes brought on by Yersinia pestis from the bubonic plague. This would indicate that the immune system likely was fighting all over the body, and many white blood cells expired in these pustules trying to destroy the virus. And given how many there are over the body, the immune system at this point would be incredibly weakened and virtually depleted. Concerning strength, much like the rest of the body, this area would have not been ignored. When you take a cell's metabolism and dramatically increase it, this causes the cell itself to enter a stage of hyperactivity as it has more energy to complete the tasks it needs to do, and with this could be things like mitosis. It's clear the virus already inspires mitosis on a massive scale all across the body, and with the literal muscle cells dividing and likely creating new strands of muscle entirely, this has led to their bodies to have this new strength not seen in normal humans. And this is why they are able to just basically wrench your head back and snap your neck like a twig most of the time. We also see the muscle growth, as with the trapezius muscles in the shoulder, being just absolutely massive. However, internally, apart from bone growth, which is pretty self-explanatory, and the muscle swoggles, there is something else going on as well. Within the grunt, as the infection continues and they're not really turning into something else, a new cancerous growth will take hold internally that is a direct reaction and adaptation for any unforeseen issues. It should be noted that while viruses want to go on living, they are not technically life, as they do not fulfill the qualifications to be deemed as such, at least by us. However, they do clearly still want to go on and continue. As a result, they have done things over millions of years that have ensured their survival, and the virus on Callisto appears to be no different. Should an attack be launched on a grunt and its body has had enough time with the virus, fail-safes will be set by the virus to be activated, likely during a specific point where an alarm hormone is sent out. Upon beating up a grunt later in the outbreak, tentacles will appear from the abdomen, and this can likely be viewed as requisitioned intestines, which present its own interesting idea as to why it appears different and why it appears to take over the body. For that, we're going to get there, so get ready. It's going to be pretty interesting. Have you ever heard of the gut-mind connection? We assume that we're in the driver's seat at all times, and currently with our big brainy brains, that's just the standard. Of course we are, but are we really? The answer is not as much as we would like to think. The gut microbiome plays a massive role into who you are and how you act, believe it or not. It has been linked to certain things like depression and anxiety, which clearly would influence behavior and choices. This is typically caused by a certain growth of different bacteria to which the neurons located in your abdomen can receive this information that is then sent to the brain. In fact, it has been noted that people who have basically had their vagus nerve severed for any reason, or have done so, by accident without surgical intervention, will be altered to a noticeable point. It's sort of like our spinal cord. We just assume it to be a bridge for our brain to communicate to our bodies. But recently, as of a few years ago, a paralyzed man was able to move his feet with a spinal stimulator placed on his spine just by thinking about walking. Despite his brain not being able to communicate with that part of his body, the spine itself may play a role in actually orchestrating the movement instead of just telling the body to move because the brain said so. This is to show when it comes to our bodies, there's still a lot of things that we need to learn, and we're still kind of a ways out from fully understanding them. So with the vagus nerve, we can assume it could be a similar process. So these tentacles, what are they? Well, I believe that they essentially are the second brain in this area responding to the attack the first brain does not seem to be able to control. It seems clear that once the body has sustained enough damage from attacks, likely adrenaline and other stress hormones are being sent out in massive amounts. All of this impacts your intestines in one way or another, and because of this, an adaptation not seen earlier in the infection process is able to take hold as a direct result to this threat. Sort of like how our bodies changed to the initial threat posed by the immune system. So seriously, you gotta check that video out. I think I'm onto something with it. But if you think this idea is crazy, you do have to understand there are a lot of neurons and nervous tissue within your gut. That's just the way it is. And you can kind of almost connect it to like a stegosaurus, how there was like a second brain in its tail, and then there was its regular brain in its head. So the tail almost had like a mind of its own, kind of like what our guts do. But once the second brain notices they're about to get got via these hormones, it will branch out with its tentacles or intestines through rapid growth and will spread all over the body. This spreading could be possibly creating damage itself, which sort of alerts those cells that they need to divide quickly to repair the internal damage much more effectively, which then leads to this size increase and new bone growth in the limbs and spinal region. Think of it like hurting yourself to get amped up for a fight. You can release the adrenaline to a small degree by attacking yourself and be ready to go faster. The same can be said with this tentacle growth. The infection hurts itself, which then causes it to respond to its own internal damages, forcing a rapid change to become stronger and clearly deal with whatever the threat is, which is Jacob with a stun baton usually. And this is why when you go directly for these guts, once this transformation starts, it is a weak point, because the second brain has essentially exposed itself, and hitting those tentacles before they can grow destroys the cascading events leading to a stronger grunt by destroying the second brain. Sort of like when you destroy the first brain, it puts it out of commission. But should you not accomplish this task, or in general overpower the grunt that is attacking, what happens? Well, it's everyone's favorite part of the video where I get demonetized. Ha! Thanks, policy changes. How do you get got by a biophage pathogen? Well, not biophage pathogen, but the biophage grunt. These grunts are well aware that you need your eyes and your brain and your blood in order to stay alive. Typically, if you cannot come out on top, this creature will go for your eyes, gouging them out, likely piercing the back of the ocular cavity, likely leading to a brain bleed, and a quick end, regardless of if it keeps up its attack. The other way is if you're standing up, it'll just kind of pull your head back, snapping your neck, as it really only takes about 3 pounds of pressure to wrench the atlas and axis apart, or the C1 and C2, the cervical vertebrae, out of order, destroying the spine, likely immediately flatlining your heart, as the brainstem can no longer communicate with your heart. While standing, they can also just pummel you in the face until you go unconscious. Another super fun one is they'll just start punching you to the ground, where they'll put their foot on your head and then rip off your arm, severing the brachial artery, which leads to a bleed out in under 30 seconds. And finally, the last one exhibits the strengths these creatures have. They will grab your head and just rip off the top of your head, which, good lord, that's pretty brutal. At least it's a quick way to go, though. So typically, Jacob is much less aggressive in his counter to these things. It really becomes about destroying the head. Using a stun baton, it can crack through the forehead region, destroying the brain in the process, as clearly these creatures are still controlled by their central nervous system. Other ways include taking off limbs and destroying their ability to move, and it's really kind of of unknown if they will recover sometime later and just get back up again. Then if they change into their secondary form by destroying the gut brain, you can take them out in this way, but it becomes more difficult as the muscle mass or mass in general has increased. Either way, it is unknown if their mitotic abilities will actually get them back up, or if they would just sort of become all the meat that we see on the walls and ground later, which definitely isn't the corruption. But anyhow, what thank you guys for watching. So I did something a little different on Roanoke Tales, basically talking about the history of Lake Lanier and why that lake in particular has such a history of taking lives, even though there's like a lake 40 miles away that gets the same amount of visitors and only has about a third of the deaths as Lanier. So if that interests you, then you know where to find that. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and channel links in the description. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you, as usual, to our astronaut, Wesley A. Weaver Jr. Thanks, Prometheus. I'd also like to thank our astrophysicist, Death Dancer, as well as Phoenix, and our scientists, Countryside Limbo, Lacune, and Vibing Shockwave. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping everything running and is greatly appreciated. All right, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.